Good evening. I'm Don Carleton, Executive Director of the Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to our program about photographic images as historical evidence. In a few minutes, I'll be joined by our very special guest tonight, historian Wendy Lower, the author of an incredible book titled The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. Wendy and I will discuss the importance of photographic images for historical research, and we'll use the outstanding example of her work, which examines a single photograph. We'll also look at the center's recently acquired archive, the Japanese Anti-Nuclear Photographers Movement Collection, a large digital archive of rare photographs documenting the after effects of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Wendy joins us today in conjunction with our current exhibit, Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, which features a selection of images from that collection. Wendy Lauer is a distinguished historian and a widely published author on the Holocaust and World War II. She holds the John K. Roth Chair at Claremont McKenna College, where she serves as the director of the Claremont's Center for Human Rights. Wendy's 2013 book, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, was a finalist for the National Book Award in the nonfiction category and a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. As I mentioned, Wendy's most recent book, The Ravine, was inspired by one photo, that of an open-air massacre in Ukraine, documenting a mother and her children being murdered by German officials and Ukrainian collaborators. That single image led her on a 10-year investigation to uncover the details behind it. The resulting book documents her investigations in Ukraine, Germany, Slovakia, Israel, and the United States, exposing the horrors of the Holocaust through the story of one family's murder. As she states in the book, and I quote, "Holocaust photographs are core historical sources that should be researched as thoroughly as written documents. More than a stable imprint of the past, this photograph is a testimony," unquote. Her words echo my own thoughts on the importance of photographs as evidence for historical research and understanding, a belief which sits at the heart of the Briscoe Center's mission. The Briscoe Center preserves original documents, photographs, publications, and artifacts that constitute the evidence essential to an understanding of the American past. One of our major goals in recent years has been to become a leading center for the archives of photojournalists and documentary photographers, all for the purpose of preserving this invaluable material for historical research. To date, we've collected approximately 8 million images, including the definitive archives of more than 75 photojournalists and documentary photographers, some of whom are Pulitzer Prize winners. Flawed and incomplete as the photographic record may be, that record is now being examined with increasing persuasion and methodological sophistication. As Wendy Lauer notes, a photograph is a document that can often be read and interpreted the same as a written text. Obviously, photography has significant limitations as historical evidence. It can distort, bias, abbreviate, and misrepresent reality. Some photographs tell us much about the past, while others tell us nothing at all. But these problems are also true with respect to written, oral, and other types of evidence. It's important to note here that quite often A photographic image can be more useful for the questions it raises than the answers it provides, such as photojournalist Charles Moore's photograph taken of Mississippi sheriffs who had gathered at Ole Miss to prevent James Meredith from integrating the university. Moore's archive is housed at the Briscoe Center. This photograph raised enough questions in the mind of journalist Paul Hendrickson that it inspired him to research and write his book, Sons of Mississippi, which was published in 2003. Photos such as this one can lead a researcher like Hendrickson and our guest today, Wendy Lower, to other sources, and sometimes even change the purpose of the research. That change most often leads to a quest to understand the history of the image itself. In other words, its backstory. Photographs cannot serve as evidence, however, if they're not preserved. And that leads me to our work with the Anti-Nuclear Photographers Movement collection. It consists of 826 images, 415 from Hiroshima and 411 from Nagasaki, taken by 50 Japanese photographers during the fall of 1945. Photos that were almost lost to history, as I'll explain. A few years ago, the members of the Japanese Anti-Nuclear Photographers Movement gathered visual evidence of the atomic bombings and then organized, preserved, and exhibited that evidence. The archive provides stunning visual evidence of what happens when even relatively small nuclear weapons are used against human beings and they're built in natural environments. It's important to note that the first H-bomb was more than 600 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. When the US dropped the atom bombs on Japan in August 1945, approximately 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 75,000 in Nagasaki were killed. Thousands more were seriously injured, permanently disfigured, and mentally scarred. As author Leslie Bloom has so well documented recently in her excellent book, Fallout, media coverage of the bombings was initially widespread and intensive, but details of the aftermath were scarce from the beginning, thanks to US government efforts to control the information. Eager that the attacks not be compared with Axis atrocities, the US worked hard to contain information about the human cost. Ironically, the Japanese military government, which had continued to tell its citizens that they were winning the war, also suppressed information about the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese military confiscated materials produced by reporters, photographers, and filmmakers who had been in the two cities immediately after the bombing. Fortunately, some of those photographers managed to hide their work. Almost immediately after the bombing, the American public were allowed to read eyewitness testimony from the B-29 crews and to see images of the mushroom clouds, like this now iconic image of the mushroom cloud over Nagasaki. But reports about what had happened on the ground were virtually non-existent. When a few photos of the impact on the cities were finally released, they were images of devastated landscapes, not dead and wounded people. These published images generally fail to register deeply with a public very familiar to seeing photos of urban ruins caused by bombing in European and other Asian cities. As a result, the photographic evidence documenting the effects was incomplete. The published photos did not include corpses or the horribly scorched women and children, their hair falling out in fistfuls, and their skin hanging loosely off their bodies. The US government managed to hide the magnitude of what happened in Hiroshima immediately after the bombing and successfully covered up the bomb's long-term deadly effects from radiation until John Hersey's famed essay in the New Yorker was published. Hersey had managed to enter Hiroshima in May 1946, but Hersey's article had no photos of Hiroshima, only a small hand-drawn map. When his essay was later published as a book, which, by the way, has never been out of print, it lacked photographs, mainly because they were suppressed and unavailable. 4 years ago, the Japanese anti-nuclear photographers movement gave the Briscoe Center the opportunity to acquire the unique photo archive it had gathered that documented the impact of the atomic bombings. We quickly agreed to take advantage of this opportunity. We saw it as significant visual evidence for historical research and teaching. The agreement the center reached with the movement included our pledge to publish a book that featured selected photos from the archive, as well as to produce an exhibition of photos from the book. In September 2020, the center published Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, and we now have opened the exhibit. The title, Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, by the way, is taken directly from the speech President Barack Obama gave during his visit to Hiroshima in 2016. The Anti-Nuclear Photographers Movement collection is also now available to students and scholars for research and teaching in the Briscoe Center's reading room. I'm very pleased that 75 years after John Hersey was unable to publish this photographic evidence in his book, Hiroshima, our book finally provides the photographs that weren't allowed to be shown when his was published. What the Japanese Anti-Nuclear Photographers Movement collection ultimately represents is a comprehensive visual history of an epical world event. Today, we take it for granted that historical events will be recorded by those experiencing them in real time. But it's important to remember that these photographs were not supposed to exist at all. Many, if not most of the images in the Japanese Anti-Nuclear Photographers Movement collection have never been published in the United States. And no similar collection in extent, size, or subject exists in this country. They are vital to our understanding of what happened when the bombs were dropped from those two American B-29s. They constitute an essential part of the history of the Manhattan Project, a part that has failed to receive as much attention in the United States as that given to the development and the delivery of those weapons. And now I want to have a conversation with Wendy Lower about the photograph she writes about in her book, The Ravine. And I want to hear her thoughts and insights about the importance of that photograph, as well as the photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and other similar images, really, to really how important these are to historical knowledge and understanding, among other issues. Welcome, Wendy. Thank you for being with us today. And I know you have a PowerPoint to show, so I now turn this over to you, and we'll come back and talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Carleton, and thanks to all at the Briscoe Center for American History in UT Austin. And I hope to come to the exhibit. I'd love to see these photographs, the way you've curated them and displayed them. And it sounds like your program has enormous resources. I'm just so glad that we made this connection. You know, it's both on the Second World War, right? We're working on basically the same era. So we have, I think, a lot to discuss today about this particular era as well, and the use of photography in the face of these mass atrocities. So thank you for inviting me. And yes, you're right. I would like to show the image that is the center of my book, the Ravine, and kind of walk you through how I analyzed it and researched it and what I was able to glean from that image in my investigation. So I guess I will do that for the next 15 minutes or so, or a little bit longer. What would you be your optimal amount of time?
That sounds good. That sounds
Okay,
fine.
so we can leave time for questions, and we can always go back to some of these images as questions arise. So thank you very much. Can you see the image on the screen here of the book?
I can, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so a little bit of a warning that we are dealing with some very difficult images, very violent images. That's the nature of our research and the subject of our talk today. I wanted to start by just addressing the fact that more generally that we know that images of suffering and even one photograph of violence has the power to move audiences and propel humanitarian action and social justice. And a lot of my book is driven by this sense that these photographs have a certain power or a certain agency, that they can put things in motion, and that they have their own kind of, not only the history of them, the kind of provenance of them, but as they are circulating in the world and moving from historians to the general public to students, that these layers of history accompany the kind of trajectory of an image, even an individual photograph. So when we think about the naked girl, so-called napalm girl fleeing the attack near Saigon, or the little boy Alan Kurdi who washed up on the beach in Turkey, and that galvanized the European community and opened up immigration, specifically in Germany. And then there are a lot of kind of iconic images from the Holocaust, like some of these. And it's often the case when I teach my seminar on the Holocaust and I talk to students and I ask them, tell me, I brainstorm, what do you know about the Holocaust and what comes to mind? There is this tendency for them to recall history through visual images, through these kinds of snapshots that are very ubiquitous on the internet and are used as illustrations in textbooks. So here we have the entrance to Birkenau. We have a couple of rare photos of what's called the Holocaust by bullets, the shooting of Jews outside the gassing centers in Eastern Europe. And this gentleman here, and this is on display in Yad Vashem. It's on display at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It's also been printed on T-shirts and mugs by anti-Zionist organizations. So there's a commercialization of these images. It's also another facet of this as well. The little boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, which was the subject of a book, or Elie Wiesel in the bunk here in the barracks of Buchenwald upon liberation, or these liberation photos, and finally this image of Anne Frank. But this kind of visual recall obviously is not accompanied by any kind of deep historical knowledge. Usually, if I push and say, well, tell me more about the history of Auschwitz-Birkenau, or the history of, in this case, this is a picture taken in Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine during the Holocaust, or do you know anything about Buchenwald or the Warsaw Ghetto? And the ability to provide any more information is limited. So in this age, this visual age that we live in, I believe that it's really important to not only use these images as kind of illustrations, but to look at them as singular sources that have their own history and that can open up new lines of inquiry and understanding about the events that they represent. This was a photo that came to my attention in 2009. I was at the museum in DC, the Holocaust Museum in DC, working in the archives on another project. And so it was a matter of chance that it was brought to me by my colleagues, and it was shown to me because it's taken in Ukraine, and I've been working on Ukraine for quite a long time, and they thought that I might have more information about it. So I started with some basic facts. The picture had been taken on October 13th, 1941. It was taken by a Slovakian photographer named Lubomir Shkrovina. It was taken in a kind of shtetl, a small town about 125 miles west of Kiev called Miropil, Ukraine. It's on the road, on the path to Kiev. From, if you know your geography, from Lviv, from Lvov. And I was immediately struck in this photograph by certain elements of it and certain features of it. I want to walk you through how this photograph tells us important reveals important facets of the Holocaust, and not only about the history of the Holocaust, but also about how we research the history. My book is not only a deep dive into what's pictured in the photograph, but I attempt in each chapter to kind of demonstrate how we do research, the methods that are available to us, interdisciplinary types of approaches that we can employ to try to get at, what's happening here, the who, what, where, when, and ultimately the why. So here at the kind of bottom of the photograph, I was struck by these shoes. And if you have been to Holocaust museums, or if you've been to some of the camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland, you may have encountered these displays that really feature the shoes, the empty shoes, what's left of the shoes, what was pulled out of the storage depots. It's all that's left of these victims was their individual shoes with their individual imprint. And so it's a kind of metaphor in our memorialization of this presence of absence, of thinking about those individuals who wore those shoes, and the fact that we don't know their stories. We have only a material kind of remnant of that individual as such, but not these kind of full-blown biographies. But this is what we have. So there's something very compelling, and there's a kind of imagination that our imaginations are kind of drawn, or we have to think about a little bit and ponder the individual victim in these shoes. And I'm going to go back to the shoes in a minute at the end of my presentation as well, and how they relate to the history. And the other aspect of the photo is broad daylight, that we see light passing through these trees, this kind of blotchy, linear curtain of trees in the background. And what does that open up in our inquiry, in our research? Well, if these events, this mass murder that's taking place in this image, this is an action shot of murder, a family at the center, it's happening in an open location during the day, in someone's hometown. These are not secretive operations behind barbed wire or behind the camp the walls of the camp system. This is part of the Holocaust by bullets. About half the victims of the Holocaust died actually outside the gassing centers, in ghetto liquidations, in death marches, and in mass shootings in what was the former Soviet Union. And in fact, 1 out of 4 victims of the Holocaust resided in the territory of Ukraine, today's borders, in these and died in these kind of open air mass shootings. And so if these are happening outdoors, then we have more witnesses among the local population. We also look at this piece of the history as an important aspect of environmental history, another area of kind of scholarly studies and inquiry that has been really taking off in the last decades. And so in my book, I try to employ some of the ideas, concepts, and discoveries of our environmental historians, including the fact that they see agency in nature, and the way that I see agency in this photograph, and the ways that the Nazis kind of put the environment to work, put nature to work, put topography to work. That's why the book is called The Ravine, because it's trying to draw attention to the fact that ravines, rivers, swamps, the general landscape of Europe was something that the Nazis, as perpetrators, as genocidaires, deliberately considered in the implementation of their genocide, in the way that the Germans had done, for instance, decades before, when they drove the Herero and Nama into the desert of South Africa and let the desert kind of, as they would say, kind of finish them off. So back in Eastern Europe during the Second World War, we know that the victims who were pushed into these mass graves or pushed into these ravines and shot, that many of them were not dead when they landed in those pits, especially the children. The Nazis didn't want to waste bullets on the children, and that they actually died because of the suffocation that they experienced, either from the blood of their kin, of their community, of the other victims, or the crush of the weight of the soil. And this means that those places, locations, these crime scenes, have all, we can discover more at these scenes as far as vegetation and the the landscape, the formations that occur, the settling of the soil, the fact that the animals go in. I mean, this is all very more of a the environmental history, as I'm saying, but it's important part of what happened, and also the aftermath and the communities that continue to, the people who continue to live in these places and how they encounter these spaces in their daily lives. And the collaborators, this was something, when I saw this in 2009, was struck by the fact that we have here a Ukrainian, his face, he's kind of grimacing here, his posture, in the act of shooting. And there we can actually see the smoke and the ballistics piece of this, as far as what happens when you have a gang like this, and they're, obviously armed, shoulder to shoulder, simultaneously shooting, execution style, generates this hovering of the smoke. And there's more than one victim. Here we can see the empty coat. Maybe this belongs to the gentleman who wore these shoes. And the halo effect of the smoke has to do with the muzzle blast here that is kind of piercing what was hovering over in that space, that shooting space. So there were victims who preceded this family and most likely followed them. We can even see down by the shoes, actually, if you zoom in and zoom out. We have the advent of digital technology. Our photographer did not have a zoom lens, but we can see the bullet casings on the floor here. Perhaps there are things here that now we can see that the photographer could not see at that intense moment when he snapped this image. And look at these collaborators. The Ukrainians and the Germans have their insignia that's also part of the detective work, trying to figure out what unit who these individuals are. Can they actually be tracked down and apprehended? Is it not too late? These two Ukrainians were actually joined by a third Ukrainian. So I came to learn that there were 3 Ukrainian killers, and there were actually 3 Germans there as well. And the photographer chose to place this family at the center of his picture. And the image follows pretty closely in the way it's cropped and printed here, the rule of thirds, with that, with the collaborators to the right, the family at the center, and the pit, the ravine kind of on the left side here. And this struck me as a deliberate choice on the part of the photographer to focus his viewfinder, his lens on the victims here, and that it is a family. And what do we do with that information? The fact that the family is at the center of his understanding of the genocide, of the Holocaust. And what did that mean for that family? What does it mean for the genocidaires to kill families? Hitler had said in the summer of 1941 that he did not want one Jewish family to remain on the continent of Europe. Himmler spoke in similar terms when he pressured his SS and police subordinates to drive women and children into the swamps of Belarus. He did not want any offspring or any surviving family members to rise up and avenge the deaths of their loved ones. So they pursued what genocide scholars call a root and branch genocide. And the Nazis themselves were obsessed with genealogy and in the family unit on a procreative side, as well, as far as trying to keep the Aryan race going across generations. And for the victims to experience the crime of all crimes, and the cruelest forms of suffering, as far as seeing your own family members and dying with your own family members, seeing them suffer, and the choices that had to be made at the time as to whether a child should find a hiding place or who should go first when one was called to the deportation center sites. So this family theme kind of runs through my book pretty prominently. I wanted to say a few things today about actually the photographer, because I think it's going to be relevant to our discussion on the Japanese photographers who documented the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, when I first looked at that image, I assumed that the photographer, and here's his testimony from 1958. So we have this great opportunity to have both his photo, which was his testimony as to what happened on that day, and we have his written account, so we can compare the two. But it turns out that the photographer, Lubomir, who gave this testimony in 1958 to a kind of KGB-like authority in Czechoslovakia, he survived the war, obviously, that he took several photos, actually. If in his camera, which we were able to obtain, we determined that there were about 7, the film that he was using could take 7 images, and we found 5 in the archives, but no negatives. And it turns out that those images he took actually are in sequence and are showing kind of the events as they unfolded, whether it's showing the Jews marching to this death, to their, to this site. And then at the end, he takes his camera and he points it down into the pit, and we see the bodies, including we see the polka dotted dress of the woman. We see her holding the hand of the little boy inside the pit. And here in this other image, this was key. I could get a front view of that German killer and get a better sense of his unit. That's not SS, that's not police. Those aren't the right, that's not the right belt buckle. Those aren't the right buttons. Those not the right emblem on his cap. These guys are customs officials. They're just, they're supposed to be in town checking packages and at the train station and whatnot. This was not there. This is an all volunteer killing unit right here. And so that other image helped me determine that. And here we see this woman, and the shoes are still there. So that's part of the sequence of events. And of course, she's being shot into the grave as well. So we have this camera craze. Here's our photographer, Lubomir, handsome man. This is a post-war photograph. And there's his camera, which he ended up donating to a museum in Bratislava before he died in 2005. He was born in 1916. So he's a young man who's drafted into this campaign. And it turns out that he is not the collaborator I thought he was. That image was so stable and so close to the action, and seemed to be taken, openly, that I had wrongly assumed that he was in uniform there and he was part of the Axis forces with the Germans, and like the Ukrainians, was sharing in this event, this anti-Semitic hate and drive towards what they called removing Judeo-Bolshevism, as they called it, from Europe at this time. But actually, this was his enough moment. This was his turning point. He had already witnessed pogroms as their unit was advancing eastward. And on this day in Mariupol, on that Monday morning, actually, on October 13th, he heard the bullets, he heard the screams, and his commander said, "Go check it out." And he was the company scribe, so he grabbed his camera, and he was this avid photographer. Here he is in a photo studio, actually in Mariupol. This is September 41. So this is just a month before that photograph was taken. He's seated at the center with his comrades. But he's part of this whole camera craze, the advent of the patenting of the pocket camera, the Leica, in the 1920s, and then they're in the Zeiss Icon. They're hitting the consumer market in the 1930s, and even the Germans are excited about telling their ordinary soldiers, bring your cameras with you to the front. And this is a advertisement. This is the optical Panzer. So this particular camera is going to withstand, the shrapnel and the warfare. And we're making history, and we're triumphantly making history, as the Germans would promote it and say, these photos are a bridge between the home front and the battlefield. So they're encouraging ordinary soldiers to kind of collect these stories, but they are discouraging them. In fact, they're forbidding them from taking photos of the mass shootings. So as soon as the mass murder phase of the Holocaust begins in the summer of 1941, these orders go down from Himmler and to stop taking photos of the mass shootings. So our photographer goes into this small town here, it's in Mariupol, and he takes these images openly, but in fact, he's secretly bringing them back to Bratislava, to Slovakia with his wife, and they join the resistance, and they bring these photos to the Jewish community there and share them with Jews who are being called up. In this case, Father Tizo and the Slovakian collaborator, he's sending the Jews of Bratislava they're among the first to arrive at Auschwitz-Birkenau, March 42. But Skrovina is showing them these photos and saying, don't go, this is where what your fate will be when you go east. And hiding Jews in his attic. One of them actually is an OBGYN who delivers his son, Lubomir Jr., into the world in 1943. So these photographs are very much a part of the resistance. And I do want to talk to Professor Carleton about that use of atrocity photography as an act of resistance. The story, I'm going to just fly through the rest of this a little bit, just in case you're curious, because I want to leave time for questions and for an exchange with Don. This is the town where it was taken, and I just want to illustrate here the loss of Jewish life, the loss of a civilization, a gutted civilization, and the aftermath of genocide. This was a bustling marketplace, and here we can see big gaps architecturally in that space. It's also the state of Ukraine's, a perilous state of Ukraine today, as far as a post-Soviet reality and continued war with Russia. And this is Mariupol, where the Jews were forced to walk to their deaths on that day. There were about 1,400 Jews in Mariupol. Very few survived. A few hundred were killed on that day, and when that photo was taken. And most Jews did not remain there after the war. When they came back and learned about the devastation, they moved on. They moved to other cities in Ukraine, or they emigrated to the United States or Israel. This is the Soviet investigation of this event, of these crimes, and they drew these very detailed sketches of showing here the arrow is showing where the victims, the Jews, were forced to march, and here's the location where the photograph was taken in this park here. The Ukrainians were arrested in the mid-80s. It was late justice, but it actually was succeeded in proving their guilt, and all three of them were convicted. It was a very thorough trial, actually, unlike the West German case, which was very perfunctory. But they don't have this photograph that we're looking at. This photograph was sitting in the archives in Prague for decades, until it came to Washington, and I got to see it in 2009. So we have justice achieved without that very incriminating photograph. But I'm seeing as I'm reading the testimony and I'm looking at the reenactments that these defendants are forced to carry out, it's matching the testimony of the photographer. It's matching the images that were taken from that day. It's corroborating what they're saying. The Ukrainians were sentenced to death. Two of them were executed in January '87. And remember, Ukraine got its independence in '91, so this is a late trial. One of them was a youth during the war, so he got 15 years in jail, and I don't know what happened to him. He was sent into the inner Russian prison system and did not return, as far as I can tell. I was really determined to find out the identities of the family. I wanted to restore their dignity. That's not how they wanted to be photographed or in their final moments of life, if they even noticed the photographer. And so I did a very thorough search of all Jewish residents in that town, and the victims lists that were drawn up, like this one immediately at the end of the war. And these are organized around family units. And the best I could do was to try to find that little boy, to look at the birth dates, and to see if there was a little boy who was born about the time the age of that boy in that photograph, because it's hard to date the ages of the other victims in the photograph. There's actually a little child also on the lap of the mother, who's kind of slipping off of her lap. So there's a woman with two children. I think Don mentioned that as well. And I did uncover a testimony from a distant relative, a cousin of these children here. And this was her aunt here on the right. And it was really rather astounding, because this woman here really reminded me, and these two children reminded me of that family unit at the center of that photograph. And this picture was taken in 1941. What was left of this Jewish family: no men, no heads of household. They were either evacuated with the Red Army, or they had been killed when the Germans arrived in July 1941. They were killed immediately. But looking at this photograph and studying it and identifying this family was, for me, very important form of both kind of research and memorialization, and reconstructing the family trees that had been severed, that had been cut down in Mariupol during the Holocaust, was part of that process of restoring that history and restoring these families' identities. showing these images, going back with these photographs again, how these images can set things in motion. And the Ukrainians today in Mariupol, asking them to look at these pictures and try to identify these Jews who lived in their hometown. And in fact, they identified more families. So it bore that kind of fruit as far as adding to those lists of names. We only have about half of the victims in Ukraine have been identified. We're missing half of them, mostly children, actually. And so one of the chapters is about this reality of genocide, of the missing, when entire communities are completely wiped out and there's no one who can come forward to even identify or even testify that they're missing a relative or they're searching for a relative. These are Ukrainian peasants who are out in the fields grazing and working in the fields with their either watching over the fields or with their cows, and they're right at the perimeter of these mass murder operations. And remember very specific aspects of that. They don't know the history of the Holocaust. They don't know the historiographical debates or the very specifics, but they knew very important details, the colors of uniforms, the size of the mass grave, the location of it, obviously, and helped us actually go into the forest, go to that site, and look more closely at the landscape. As I told you, there were more clues and more things to discover there. And immediately struck by the topography and how mangled it was. And it was a kind of moonscape. There's this haloing effect. There were depressions. It was not natural erosion. It was clearly, there was an invasive kind of human impact on this space. And as we reached down onto the ground and removed some of the leaves and the muck, we found the bones of the victims. Now this is in 2016, and the event happened in 1941. We found vertebrae, we found skull fragments, because when the Soviets went in and they did their investigation in this invasive way with bulldozers and trucks trying to find the bones for the trial, they basically undertook another assault on these victims who really have seen no rest at all, their souls in this particular space. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is this, to go back to the shoes and to think about how photographs and images interact with other sources that we use, and including our imagination, and help us try to fill in the missing or this kind of presence of absence. These empty shoes and the crumpled coat exist here as questions and as gaps in knowledge, and they remind us of the victims whom we cannot see and the many who were murdered and remain missing. Prior to and during the Holocaust, empty shoes figured in abstract art, literature, and photography as symbols of humanity, and the use of shoes to depict loss is not only a post-war curatorial technique of Holocaust museums. As historical sources of material culture, shoes have come to asceticize absence and mourning on a large scale. A Yiddish poet, Abraham Sitzkaver, actually wrote an incredible poem called A Load of Shoes. And he wrote this when he discovered his deported mother's shoes in the Vilna ghetto. And I just want to read a couple stanzas from that poem. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride. Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps, look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others. Sitzkaver's poem was written in January 1st, 1943. Empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist there, somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers. Unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronzed as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. One photograph can pass across time and space from its creator to family members, prosecutors, curators, historians, and the viewing public. It can put things in motion and elicit from those who study the image or are questioned about it an avalanche of information and emotion, and tug at our ethical sensibilities. The afterlife of the photograph can become an ongoing story with twists and turns, like testimony given in words. It can be subject to manipulation, such as cropping or airbrushing. Atrocity images, like the rare ones that attest to the acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you very much.
Well, Wendy, and I hope that, can you hear me? I hope, the wonders of Zooming, you never know if you're coming through or not. When I saw your book the first time and I saw the photograph for the first time, my immediate reaction was, as a human being, not a historian, the emotional impact and it's just, you look at that photograph and I see you could see your own mother there holding you. It's just, well, even now, I mean, even though I've looked at this book and heard this, I'm still affected. Then the professional side of me has to take over as a historian. And that's one of the reasons, beyond the human impact, the emotional impact. I just have to tell you that this is just an exceptional analysis of this photograph in terms of the elements of information, just from an objective point of view, as a scholar. I really can't think of a better case study illustrating the use of, there's a lot of reasons for this book, okay? But I'm just focusing on a sort of another aspect of it. But there's really not a better case study, in my opinion, illustrating the use of photography and historical research. You truly read this image, and you clearly explain how you've done that. The depth of the research on this is stunning for me. I've been doing this for many years, and I stand in awe at what you've accomplished here. Let's go for a second, though, to something that you made a remark about, and that is about really the whole issue of the controversies, I should say, about showing and displaying these kinds of images. In your book, you note that questions were raised at the U.S. Holocaust Museum about and I quote from your book here, explicit imagery, including the pornography of murder, nudity, and violence in a museum, raising the question, I should add, of the appropriateness of that. You also write, and I quote, "Some post-war theorists of photography would urge us to not look at, let alone scrutinize, the suffering of others. One might even argue that such images include the pornographic, as the camera is aimed in this particular photograph that you've chosen. The camera is aimed at the woman and the child. You obviously refer here, among others, to Susan Sontag, who warned that the shock of atrocity photography, quote, wears off with repeated viewings. We were very careful in our presentation of the Japanese photographs, of which we've actually spared the audience the most horrible images in that collection. We were very careful to ensure that we weren't exploiting the victims of the atomic bombings. I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit more about that issue, and not only about the photograph, well, really about what Sontag says and where your position is on this and how it might relate to even our collection.
Yeah, it's a really multifaceted issue. There are not any kind of easy answers. I think part of the problem with that debate was that it was trying to deal with the images as a whole. and just assume that they can be kind of thrown into one box, as it were. I mean, there are differences between the nude corpses that are piled up and the image that I showed you of the clothed victims. And, there are, first of all, we can't suppress these images, right? So some of those debates, whether Susan Crane was saying, choose not to look, argued that when we do this kind of analysis, this kind of clinical analysis of these victims in these images, we're subjecting them to another kind of assault, as it were. It's a denigrating kind of hyper scientific look, a kind of cold, calculating look, and even makes a reference to experiments that were that victims in the camps were subjected to. That they become kind of like almost like guinea pigs again in our scholarly inquiry. That can go that far. So that's something to be aware of. I mean, I think most of these arguments point out things that we should be aware of, but they're not like the theories. I don't think we should accept, fully, as far as trying to guide our research or even hamper our research. I think, first of all, when we're talking about genocide, and we're talking about in this case in Ukraine, where there's so many victims, where there's no documentation. So first of all, you get to the reality of being an historian, trying to write history from like very few sources, when more than 1 million people are gone. And how am I going to reconstruct this based on some numbers or, some scattered documents? We can't, if we don't dig, if we don't try to fight, to figure out how to write that history, aren't we also kind of in a way continuing the wish of the perpetrators as far as complete suppression and silence and absence and not taking on that challenge? They obviously, the genociders, want this to be suppressed, and went around all these mass graves and disinterred the victims and ground up their bones and did all this erasure. So from an ethical standpoint, I think that is for history and for our future incumbent upon us to do that work. And resist what in fact was the vision of the genocide era, which is complete erasure, right? Then there's the reality of, okay, well, what images are we looking at? And what's our responsibility to those victims in the image? It's someone's grandmother, it's someone's relative. Is that the image that we need to blow up as you walk into the museum, or the image that we're going to put on, commercialize, or make the center of attention? Are we going to put that image up with no caption and no context? So those are the choices that we make in real time as scholars and curators and museologists and educators, including these kinds of the use of them in the classroom, which is another context. So I don't think anyone should set up kind of hard and fast rules of looking and not looking, using and not looking. It's just this more refined process that's part of our discussion today, and part of the scholarly approach to this that is helpful for learning more about the history and for disseminating it in a public way.
When I was in Japan and meeting with a lot of folks over there in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo, and particularly with the members of the movement, the photographers movement, who were entrusting us, frankly, with this, to them, sacred collection of images. And they were very concerned by these very issues we're talking about right now, and they were they very much wanted. They questioned me and examined my feelings about exactly what we're talking about right now. And I'm not trying to compare what happened in Japan with the atomic bombings to the Holocaust. What I'm trying to look at here is really confronting the horrors of human crimes, or even just human actions, whether you think that the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan was a crime or not is really beside the point in terms of what we're talking about here, I think. And I really spent a lot of time assuring them that what our purpose, that these images would be treated with great respect, and because like I said, the relics, for example, just the simple, like the the twisted bicycles and the melted shoes, and that you can see in the museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are really treated like sacred objects. So I really, I felt that way anyway, but those feelings were greatly affirmed by going over there and talking to these folks.
Another issue that comes up is the talking about the survivors in the case of the Holocaust, and it may be the same as far as the survivors in Japan, and individuals who kind of speak on behalf of the survivors as a community when it's obviously a very diverse community. And so I kind of put this to the test as far as some theorists who say, oh, survivors, this is, offensive to them, or they don't want these out in circulation. And in fact, when you look at the video testimony survivors gave, in this case at the USC Shoah Foundation, I looked at the photographs that they present in their presentations, their audiovisual presentations, or at the Fortunoff Archive at Yale. And many times they put up an atrocity photo right in front of the camera to the interviewer and say, look at this. This is what happened to us. Don't you dare shy away. You're shying away from the reality of what we experienced. I mean, they're insulted by the suppression of it, right? Because that's as close as it's going to get. There are things in these images that they say are unimaginable and unspeakable. And they hang on to, they cling to these images because they help them remember, and they help them communicate that reality that we are so, removed from. So I don't think that, making claims on behalf of survivors, as a whole is really a way to argue for or against these images as well.
Yeah, it's the same situation in Japan. Again, the circumstances, the causes, and everything else are different, obviously, but there's the same thing going on there with this, with these images. And well, let me ask you, and we'll go get we have some questions from the audience, so I know we don't have unlimited time, but quickly, just as far as you're familiar with the archive that we've acquired from Japan. You have a copy of Flash of Light book. I just want to get your thoughts about that. Yes, that is it.
Gorgeous.
I'd like your thoughts about what we're doing with these photographs and even having them.
Well, first of all, these are incredibly important for filling in that perspective of the Japanese survivors on the ground, these amateur photographers, professional photographers, to even fill in that piece of the history. And I really appreciated how you started out the presentation by showing us that mushroom cloud and showing us that distorted reality of so-called precision bombing from above, when there's really is so removed from the victims dropping the bombs, right? And that kind of, way of carrying this out, in contrast to the intimacy of the violence that we see in my photograph, right? So these images help us understand the impact of those bombings on ordinary Japanese in these two cities. And then when we start, so once we open our mind to that, and we become the kind of witness to that. I mean, there's a great book that I like to use by Sharon Slavinsky called Human Rights in Camera, and there are interesting theories on spectatorship and witnessing. And that moment when you look at these images, which, in your collection here, you have a very interesting combination of landscapes, of destruction as far as urban architecture, and moonscapes, and environmental destruction, and then people in those settings just trying to function and trying to come out of that rubble, come out of those scenes and function those scenes. Close-ups of the victims themselves and the burns and their conditions of their skin and their suffering in that way. It's really was all new to me. I mean, because I'd been to the museum in Hiroshima, and we can talk about that as far as what really stood out, including the clocks, the other artifacts. But I had not seen this history from the perspective of Japanese on the ground. That to me was really compelling. And the combination of the destruction, physical destruction, and the human suffering and the environmental destruction, and these panoramic views that show us the scale, and then these close-in portraits that show us the individual experience, I think is really, really powerful, really powerful. So, and then it's part of this movement, anti-nuclear movement, that again, back to the image, the power of the image, first documenting what happened, that these Japanese photographers in a way say, I was there, this is what happened, this is criminal, this is outrageous, this is above and beyond. Like my photographer realizing this is not war, this is something else. That as a spectator forces one, you know, you can go back to the ethics of Kant and his idea of world spectator, but you in a way that written documents don't convey, you have to inhabit that space in your imagination. And then this begins the process of response. What's elicited? And is it empathy? Is it humanitarian action? Is it mobilizing? And in this case, the Japanese photographers who not only captured this, but felt it and smelled and you know, physically experienced it, and from an emotional and sensory standpoint, then galvanized this anti-nuclear campaign. So I just think the whole, you know, of course you can look at some of these images and think about as well. I wanted to ask you about a Japanese aesthetic, because it's not only the evidentiary value of these images and historical value, but I'm wondering about what was their eye in the lens, like what did they capture that I can't appreciate because they have a different cultural way of envisioning panorama or portrait. So I was hoping you could help me understand.
Well, that's an excellent point. No, you're absolutely right there. But you also touched on something else, and that is that when I was there, they of course were very curious to know what my purpose was. They had their own purpose for placing this archive here, so we had to discuss. We had to talk that out, and I said, well, what's your purpose? I said, because one thing that we're not interested in and we don't need to do is relitigate the war. The war has happened. There are entire libraries dedicated to the causes and everything else. And they said, okay, well, that's you know, comforting, because we're not interested in doing that either. And we realized, and where we had a meeting of the minds and where the deal was sealed, was that we have a common enemy. We're friends now and allies, but we have a common enemy, and that is nuclear war. And that's what seals the deal for us to get this archive, because that was their purpose as well. It wasn't to relitigate the war or to make accusations about American war crimes or anything else. And it wasn't our purpose to talk, you know, to attack the Japanese about the war and their military government. So anyway, it's a universal thing here, and it resonated on both sides. We have the same purpose, and that's an opposition to nuclear war. We have some questions, not surprising, and we have some limited time, and I want to go to Aaron Purdy, who is our Director of Communications at the Briscoe Center. Aaron, you want to tell us what you have here, please?
Yeah, we do. We have some wonderful questions from the audience. First of all, Michael Sturley has asked that he noticed this is being recorded, and he wants to share that link with his daughter, who's in graduate school in Europe studying these issues. And Michael, to answer your question first, yes, we are recording this with the intention that we will be sharing this presentation online in the future. So keep an eye on the Briscoe Center's website and social media. We'll get this presentation up as soon as we can. Dr. Lauer, Alan has this question for you. How successful do you think your research would have been if you encountered this photograph 20 years earlier in 1989 instead of 2009? Was the advent of the internet essential to your success in piecing together the story?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question, because he's absolutely right. I would not have been able to write this book in 1989 or even 10 years earlier, 1999, or I mean, it really, as I said, I try to stand back and take note of and appreciate the developments methodologically in Holocaust scholarship. And having been the former kind of acting director of that research institute and worked for many years at the museum in DC and worked in the world of kind of artifacts and photography and storytelling through all these different medium, that it gave me the opportunity to see how stories can be discovered and reconstructed, and history can be narrated by pulling together all these different aspects of how we do our research, not just straightforward archival empirical research, but material culture, environmental history, representations, the photograph, the Nazi documentation, testimony, interviewing, field work, going to the crime scenes, talking to all these people and all these different experts, whether they're, as I mentioned, I talked to a ballistics expert. So opening myself up to all these different, or contacting people at the Smithsonian about the bones and trying to figure out how to identify the bones. So that's something that Holocaust studies and genocide studies have really, those kinds of advances I wanted to kind of showcase in a way. I'm kind of proud of all that work and the institutions that have invested in that. And I thought it might be helpful for graduate students. I thought, if I were a graduate student going into history, this might inform my work, regardless of whether you're working on the Holocaust or any other chapter in history, but just the ways that these things can be done and pursued. But for sure, the internet, the databases and the database searches that can be done now, and the way that we use the web to contact people through Facebook. I found the photographer's family, so that kind of discovery process is often advanced, accelerated by the internet. But buyer beware, because I also point out in my book that we have to be careful when you put in these names of people, names of places, what have you, put in these searches and you don't get a hit. I mean, I think about it sometimes like the gamble of, just even when you're if you're pulling down the arm of a slot machine, like what's going to come up, and we often think if it doesn't come up, if we don't get a match, then we move on to something else. Like there's somehow that doesn't exist, like that history doesn't exist, or it can't be found out. So we do run the risk of thinking that, if it's not on the internet or it's not findable through a Google search, then somehow, it can't be discovered, or worse, it didn't happen.
I will say, as a researcher myself, one of the things I appreciated about your book, about the Ravine, was that you really did take the reader on this discovery process with you through all the different methods that you just discussed. So for folks who have not yet gotten the book, I really recommend just to learn about the process of how you did find these different sources, including online. We have a question from Jeffrey and Dr. Carleton. I'd like you to take a first stab at this. First of all, he says, this is a terrific presentation. Thank you. You spoke about some of the psychological effects on the photographers. Could you speak more about how they dealt with their experiences?
Well, I wish I could. I'm not a photographer, and I wish we had, that would be a good thing if we had one of these photographers like Lucian Perkins, whose archive we have. And many of the photographers, Matthew Nathan's, several, many of the photographers we have were here to talk about that. I feel it's a great question, but I'm really not able to answer it accurately, I don't think, and adequately. I'm not sure that it would be fair for me to try to answer it. I can only speak as an observer of their work, and I'm in awe of the people that we're working with who are photographers and their whole craft of photography. But as far as the actual experience of doing these things, I'm just not in a position to speak to that. Good question, though.
We know from Dr. Lauer's brief mention, but also there's a very detailed chapter in her book about the photographer of the Ravine image. Don, what do we know about the photographers whose works are part of the ANPM collection?
Well, we know quite a bit about those photographers, and there's a lot of detail in Flash of Light, the book, that we were able, fortunately, to uncover the information about those photographers and also to put them in that book. And really, I think in some ways, well, a couple of those photographers were already well known, but many of the others were not. And I'm particularly pleased that we've brought those photographers, what they were able to accomplish under pretty horrific environment, and the terror that they were looking at through their camera lenses, and bring that out in the book. We're how much we've worked on building our photograph collections, and how closely we work with photographers. So that's one of the things, one of many goals that we had in doing this project, was to bring out the work of these photographers.
Okay. Dr. Lauer, Linda would like to know, how was the geotagging discovered? The date, the place, etc. of the photo? Was it from the photographer's written testimony? And she also notes this is important, dedicated research.
Thank you. Yes, in that testimony from 1958, the photographer is very explicit about the location and the date, and he was actually interrogated several times, including during the war, because these pictures were so incriminating, and he was suspected of being in the resistance. So that's how we got that basic information, and it's so important, to a lot of times we have hundreds of thousands of photographs that have been digitized, millions from the Second World War is one of the most photographed wars on record, and the Holocaust included. And so, when you come across these photographs and there's nothing on the back, there's no caption, it's really hard to get started. I mean, so at the very least, when you get these important nuggets of information, that can be your starting point. I mean, my photographer was really haunted by these images the rest of his life. And that's why he donated his camera to the Museum of the History of Jews in Bratislava, with the very expressed wish in his donation letter that the camera be on display in conjunction with an exhibit on the Holocaust. He also realized that he was one of the few people to capture, excuse me, the Ukrainian collaboration at that level of actually shooting, because that history had been whitewashed. So he was very determined to get his kind of message out, which makes him this documentary photographer and not a kind of ordinary citizen who just happened to snapshot something and then put it into the airwaves. I mean, he spent the rest of his life actually trying to get his testimony into public view as best he could. And it's something that I think has happened, since, as far as I know, and I'd love Don's input on this, because I came to this field late, the history of photography, but I mean, it strikes me that in the 20th century, with the growth of photography, there's, pictorial reporters kind of in the 30s, right? Flashbulbing and taking pictures of prominent figures and so forth, or working for big magazines that are splashy magazines. And then there's photojournalists who kind of align themselves with kind of what would be the newspaper industry and that the print industry, kind of illustrated journals. But then I was reading more recently about what is a term called the humanitarian photographer, that photographers self-identify within this other realm, not just journalistically capturing any event, could be the Super Bowl, but there are journalists now who really go into these scenes. It's like Journalists Without Borders, who put themselves in these human rights, often right in the center of the atrocities or the warfare embedded, and take on those risks because they want to get these messages out. They want to make sure the world knows about these events in that way. And those journalists often have difficulty kind of returning back to normal civilian life, like a traumatized soldier would.
I think they're all, to one extent or another, they're all traumatized by what they do. I mean, we have the photography of Spider Martin, who was at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and is the one who took the iconic photographs of John Lewis and his fellow folks being beaten bloody on Bloody Sunday. And these are traumatizing events, and the photographers, I know several of them were traumatized and still are, frankly. Lucian Perkins, for example, all of his work in the Persian Gulf, and Dirk Halstead and the Vietnam War, and on and on and on. We tend, from our standpoint, in terms of collecting and explaining their work, we break them down into between photojournalists and documentary photographers, and the difference is for different people have different views about what these folks do and who they are, but basically the photojournalists, we view them as basically journalists with cameras. They happen to have, they do their work through photography, but they're basically journalists. And they're capturing images that are going to be very valuable to history in the future, almost immediately in some cases. But their primary goal is to get the news to consumers, to the consumers of the news. The documentary photographers like Fred Baldwin and Wendy Watrous, for example, they tend to, what they do, Steve Shames is another one. They have a goal in mind. They have a project in mind, some aspect of life, current culture, the times that they want to capture. We have Russell Lee, for example, Russell Lee's archive, who was an FSA photographer, and he spent his entire career doing really documenting processes and events and so forth. So they're divided between those two. And of course, being photographers who have to have bread on the table, all photographers do a lot of other photographic work. Most of them do. Carolyn Cole is another photographer that I should mention, whose archive we have. Carolyn Cole has spent most of her career at the LA Times, photographing war and violence. She's she's had enough of that, I think, and she's now on to other things. But it's traumatizing too. We have a podcast with Carolyn, and she gets into this issue, frankly. So these are all good questions, but we from our point of view, we were often asked, are we like an art museum, are we purely interested in the aesthetic value of an image? And we appreciate aesthetics of a photograph, but that's not what we do. We're a history research center, and our job is to pull together all the materials, the photographic images, plus the papers of the photographer. Plus they're good as well as they're bad, quote unquote bad. And when I say bad from their point of view, they're not the photographs that they wish that, they had framed it differently or whatever, but as you've demonstrated, these images can be incredibly important for historical research, and it doesn't matter what the aesthetic is. And so that's the difference about what we do, is that we're not interested particularly in the aesthetics of the image. Ours, again, is focused on this material is just for the value it has for historical research, which is why I'm so enthralled by what you have done, because it really encapsulates our whole initiative and mission, what we're trying to do.
We have a couple.
Aaron, do you have anything else?
Yeah, we have a couple more questions.
Okay.
I think we still have a few more minutes here. Stephanie has commented, we are at a point where the last generation of Holocaust survivors are about to pass. Given this conversation, don't you feel that bearing witness, at least during this time of Holocaust denial, is so much more important than worrying about offending propriety?
Yeah, this is a really important point, because we are at this moment where history will be fading. That's what happens generationally as we talk to our students. I mean, they don't ask them a question about the Cold War and their eyes glaze over. I mean, so it's just the natural passage of time, and also the passage of the witnesses, that allows for increased denial, and this forgetting and not understanding the real depths of what happened and the cruelties, and that, I mean, you can call it shock value, whatever it is that grabs people's attention as far as this really matters, this is serious, this is almost existential genocide, right? To our peril, we don't look at something like this and really register and accept the fact that this is what we're capable of, and it can happen anywhere. So yes, this is another reason why these images not only have to be researched and dealt with, very carefully, but not suppressed because of what they capture. And obviously, in many cases, we don't have any written words, let alone audiovisual testimonies from survivors that really show this. I mean, even this image here that we've been focusing on, the shooting of the fact that the Ukrainians are shooting at such close range. These collaborators, they don't speak the same language. These are local Ukrainians and Germans who just came in as occupiers. And then there's an onlooker there. They have nothing kind of quote unquote in common as far as their national kind of ethnic backgrounds. And yet they participate in this act together in this kind of intimate way. And so, yes, these are really important for future attempts to deny, whitewash, suppress.
Don, I think you're muted.
Yeah, there I am. I'm sorry.
There we
I think
go.
we have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, we have one from Lyle along the lines of what we were just discussing. He wants to know, was the Mirapol Ravine photograph rare in its potential for historical excavation, or would you say that was sufficient time and resources? This is often the case with Holocaust atrocity photographs.
Yeah, so I think that not every picture can be researched with as much depth. I mean, I would like everybody to take on the challenge and start and see how far one can get. That's kind of the call here, the call to action as far as stopping and not even thinking of these things as kind of illustrations and kind of a peripheral to the history. They're central to the history. But you're right, not all of them have that potential, actually. You will come to these cul-de-sacs in the archives. You will come to these kinds of dead ends. And I couldn't identify the family with certainty, for instance. But yeah, I was lucky that we had the photographer's testimony to fill that out. Lucky that we found more of the photographs to see that it was part of a kind of a narration, his own narration of events in a visual way. Lucky that I could find that Ukrainian investigation, that Soviet investigation, right? And then I could go to that actual site and meet people who were still living witnesses. So, but I wouldn't have known that in 2009 unless I, committed to it. And the other thing is that as you start to get into this, of course, you find other things. You may start with one photograph, but will lead you to another one that in fact has a lot more material to substantiate kind of a full-on book or full project, as it were. And I can think of a few that I came across where there's potential for more in-depth work, definitely.
Well, Wendy, please, my sincere thanks to you for agreeing to be with us today. Wendy's in sunny California, sunny Southern California. It looks like
sunsetting California.
But thanks for being here to share your really deeply informed thoughts and observations. I want to urge the audience to buy a copy of the Ravine and for an in-depth examination, not only of the terrific incident, the horrific incident, I should say, but that you've so deeply researched, but also as a primer for anyone who needs to use photographic evidence in their research. I mean, it's a how to do it. That's one of the many uses of this book. I also hope the members of our audience will get a copy of the Center's book, Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, for the same reasons. And for you all, those of you in the audience, please know that the resources of the Briscoe Center, which is located on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin, adjacent to the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum, are available to all who need those resources. You can find more information about the center at our website, briscoecenter.org. Those are all small letters, no capitals, briscoecenter.org. Thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks again, Wendy.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.